The Tower of London, built in 1078 by William the Conqueror, not only marked the beginning of a Norman era of power over England, but also became the site of some of the most cruel and terrifying executions in British history. Strategically located on the banks of the River Thames, the fortress was conceived as a symbol of the monarchy's authority and, over time, became a place where the most brutal punishment was a tool used to instill fear and control. As English power consolidated, so did the tower's sinister reputation as a site of public and gruesome deaths. From decapitated nobles to anonymous prisoners, the tower witnessed execution methods that were not only violent, but also designed to humiliate and terrify. Although most of the history focuses on the tower as a symbol of defense, very few know the full story that lies within its walls. The executions that took place there were a macabre spectacle, where the lives of the condemned were taken in the most grotesque ways. The techniques used, some more elaborate than others, were as ruthless as the regime that ordered them. The White Tower through history. Since its foundation in 1078, the White Tower has been the epicenter of British history, a testament to Norman engineering skill and the beating heart of the Tower of London. Its walls, rising 90 feet high and with a base thickness of up to 15 feet, were constructed with Kentish stone and reinforced with the canary stone brought from Normandy, the homeland of William the Conqueror. This fortress, standing as a masterpiece of Norman architecture, dominated the medieval skyline of London with its imposing silhouette. Measuring 118 feet by 105 feet, the White Tower was the largest structure of its kind in Christian Europe, a symbol of power that would echo for centuries. The architect behind this monumental construction was Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, who supervised the creation of a fortress that was not only meant to defend the city, but also convey the authority of the new rulers. Among the prominent innovations was the entrance, defended by 4 towers and accessible only via wooden stairs, which could be destroyed during a siege, thus ensuring the fortress's security. Over the centuries, the White Tower underwent numerous expansions under various monarchs. During the reign of Richard the Lionheart, the construction of the moat around the tower began in 1190, while his brother, King John, further reinforced its defences. However, it was Henry II who truly transformed the tower, ordering the addition of the Wakefield and Lantern Towers, which created luxurious royal apartments decorated with tapestries and frescoes. In 1236, Henry III ordered the walls of the Queen's Chamber to be decorated with roses and winter and summer branches, symbolizing the opulence and power of the kingdom. The White Tower also housed a royal menagerie from 1235, including exotic animals like a polar bear brought from the King of Norway. This bear was taken to the River Thames to fish, a curiosity that fascinated Londoners. But the true magnificence of the tower lay in its crown jewels, which were kept in the jewel house from 1303. Among these jewels was the famous Cullen diamond, weighing 3.16 carats, the largest uncut diamond ever discovered. The imperial state crown, for example, contains 2,868 diamonds, 273 pearls, 17 sapphires, 11 emeralds, and 5 rubies. In 1671, Colonel Thomas Blood attempted to steal the jewels, but after being captured, King Charles II pardoned him and granted him Irish lands. Among the many roles the White Tower served, it was also the Royal Mint, where millions of silver pennies were minted during the Middle Ages. Records show that in 1279, over 4 million pennies were minted in a single year. This highlights the crucial role the tower played in medieval England's economy. The royal armories, which emerged during Queen Elizabeth I's reign, housed enough military equipment to arm 15,000 men, underscoring its role as a centre of power and defence. Over the centuries, the White Tower went from being a royal residence to a state prison. In 1101, the first recorded prisoner, Bishop Ranulph Flambard, made a famous escape using a rope tied to a wine barrel. This escape led to significant security improvements, including iron bars on the windows. During the Wars of the Roses, the tower became a symbol of imprisonment and execution, particularly in the Salt Tower, which housed prisoners accused of witchcraft. The tower also witnessed the tragedies of figures like Lady Jane Grey, whose final inscription, Jane, on the tower walls remains a painful reminder of her fate. The tower reached its greatest military relevance during the English Civil War, when it was taken by parliamentarian forces in 1642. Records show that the tower housed 15,000 small arms, 200 barrels of gunpowder, and numerous cannons. The tower's constable, Sir John Byron, surrendered without resistance, leading the royalist poet Sir John Denham to lament, "That sacred place is no longer sacred, but a house of betrayals." The tower became a symbol of the political instability that shook England during that period. The White Tower continued to play a military role during World War II, suffering damage from German bombings, especially during the Blitz of 1941. However, its symbolism of resistance remained intact. In 1941, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, was briefly imprisoned in the tower, becoming the last high-ranking prisoner held there. The final executions at the tower took place in 1941, when Joseph Jacobs, the last prisoner executed, faced a firing squad. The White Tower is accompanied by a mythical figure that has captivated popular imagination, the Tower Ravens. According to legend, the kingdom will fall if the ravens leave the fortress. For this reason, Charles II ordered that 6 ravens always be kept at the tower, and today 7 are maintained, the 6 required plus 1 spare. These ravens are cared for by the Raven Master, and their presence is believed to guarantee the kingdom's stability. Thus, the White Tower remains an eternal symbol of British history, a place that has witnessed betrayals, powers, secrets, and victories over more than 900 years. Each stone, each wall, and each room holds the stories of the nation, making it one of the most iconic monuments in the world. The Dark Art of Death, the executioners of the Tower of London. The Tower of London, known for its imposing architecture and legacy as a prison, is also the setting for one of the darkest professions in history, the executioners, responsible for carrying out the most public and macabre executions in the kingdom. For centuries, these men, feared and rejected by society, sealed the fate of noble and royal figures, and their profession left an indelible mark on England's history. But behind each blow of the axe or cut of the sword, there is a story of skill, rituals, and a psychological burden that few know. Richard Brandon, the king's executioner. One of the most notorious executioners of the Tower was Richard Brandon, famous for executing King Charles I in 1649. The king's execution during the English Civil War was a historic event that not only changed the fate of the country, but also marked Brandon forever. The act was so shocking that it is said the executioner never escaped the psychological torment that followed. Although Brandon received a considerable reward for his task, £30, which would now equate to several £1,000s, the emotional burden of having killed a monarch haunted him until his death. The profession of executioner, though lucrative, came at a high cost in terms of social stigmatization. Executioners were marginalized, regarded almost as outcasts of society. They lived in isolated rooms within the tower complex, far from the other workers and prisoners, and were rarely allowed to partake in common social interactions. Their trade defined them, but it also condemned them to ostracism. Another executioner who left a dark mark on history was John Catch, known for his inability to carry out his work with skill. During the 17th century, Catch was famous for his botched executions, earning him the mockery of society and the nickname Jack Catch. His lack of ability became a kind of urban legend. It is said that his clumsiness in carrying out executions was so evident that his name became synonymous with ineptitude. Bad executions were not only a macabre spectacle, but also associated the executioner's figure with shame and failure. Despite his reputation, Catch continued in his profession for years, immortalized in popular ballads and gossip of the time, being one of the most well-known and least respected executioners in the history of the Tower. The art of decapitation, a deadly technique. The job of an executioner was not as simple as wielding an axe or a sword. Decapitating the condemned, especially among the nobility and royalty, required outstanding skill. The executioners working at the Tower had to possess great physical strength and precision, as mistakes could result in a failed execution, further increasing the suffering of the victim and the humiliation of the executioner. The axe, used for most executions, weighed around 7 pounds with an 18-inch blade. Handling this tool required years of practice, as a poorly aimed blow could prolong the suffering of the condemned. However, in the case of executions of high nobility or royalty, the sword was often used. This, much harder to wield, was considered a more honorable act, reserved only for those of high birth. In some cases, experienced swordsmen were hired specifically to carry out the task, as was the case with Anne Boleyn's execution, which was performed by a skilled swordsman to ensure a swift and painless death. The scaffold, a stage for death. The scaffold, where executions took place, was a precisely designed structure, not only to perform the act, but also to ensure that the crowds could witness it in full. These platforms were high, around 15 feet, allowing spectators to clearly see the execution. In some cases, such as the execution of Lady Jane Grey in 1554, the scaffold became a place of great public attention, where the victim would walk to the very spot of her death, often with a prayer in hand. Tower Green, a private space within the tower, was where secret executions took place away from the public gaze. In this small space, measuring just 33 by 24 feet, the condemned faced their fate. The execution block, made of solid oak, was carefully prepared, and straw was often spread on the ground to absorb the blood, all in an attempt to maintain the solemnity of the act. The rituals surrounding the execution were both practical and symbolic, aiming for a certain degree of respect towards the condemned, even in the moments before their death. Rituals and superstitions, the psychological cost of the job. Being an executioner was not just a matter of skill, it also required considerable emotional strength. Many executioners had specific rituals to calm their nerves before carrying out an execution. Some, like Francis Threadkill, an executioner in the 15th century, kept detailed personal diaries where they recorded the prayers they recited before each execution and the superstitions they believed in. The tradition of sleeping with an axe under the pillow or reciting special prayers before each fatal act was part of the mental preparation for these men. Moreover, executioners were known for their superstitions. Many kept pieces of the hanging rope, believing it brought good luck. William Marwood, an executioner in the 19th century, continued this practice, leaving records that the rope, like the axes and swords, held a kind of mystical power that influenced the fate of those who used them. The psychological impact on the executioners was profound. Some, like Thomas Derrick, who started his career as a criminal and was then pardoned in exchange for his trade, wrote in his diaries about the emotional trauma they experienced. The nights after executing the condemned were especially hard, as executioners were often haunted by visions of the victims and the guilt of their acts. The job of executioner at the Tower of London was much more than just an execution task. It was a role filled with responsibility, rituals, and psychological costs. Over the centuries, these men faced not only the death of others, but also the internal death of their own morality, sacrificing their emotional well-being and place in society to fulfill a dark duty. Over the years, the name of the executioner became synonymous with death and despair, and the echoes of those tragedies still resonate in the halls of the Tower, where the past remains alive, reminding us that death, in all its forms, was always lurking. Failed executions, when death doesn't go as planned. Throughout the history of the Tower of London, executions were not always as clean and quick as expected. Death on the scaffold, far from being an orderly and professional process, sometimes turned into a macabre spectacle of clumsiness and prolonged suffering. Poorly carried out executions by a trembling or inexperienced executioner marked some of the darkest moments in the Tower's history. The brutal execution of Margaret Pole, 1541. One of the most infamous and bloody executions was that of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, in 1541. At 67 years old, the Countess refused to place her head on the block, which led to a heartbreaking chase by the executioner. The man tasked with her execution, Alexander Burwell, was a young man with no experience in the trade, and upon seeing the noblewoman's resistance, began striking her frantically with his axe. According to witness accounts, the Countess ran around the scaffold while the executioner chased her, delivering erratic blows that failed to land precisely. It took a total of 11 strikes to finally end her life, a scene that left those present horrified. Burwell, traumatized by the brutality of the event, soon abandoned his post as an executioner and retreated to a monastery in Norfolk. The failed execution of Margaret Pole is remembered as a symbol of inexperience and disregard for human suffering, one of the most macabre in the Tower's history. The unfortunate end of Sir Alexander Carew, 1645. It wasn't only Margaret Pole who suffered from a botched execution. In 1645, the decapitation of Sir Alexander Carew also became a public scandal when the executioner, Ralph Griffin, repeatedly failed in his attempts to behead the condemned man. It took 4 strikes to complete the execution, which provoked an angry reaction from the crowd. The spectators, visibly outraged, forced Griffin to leave the scene under the protection of armed guards. These disastrous executions not only tarnished the reputations of the executioners, but also turned the act of death into a humiliating spectacle for all involved. The drama of royal pardons. One of the most dramatic aspects of executions at the Tower was the monarch's power to grant pardons in the final moments. These unexpected interventions led to scenes filled with tension and desperation, often arriving too late to save the condemned. In 1483, Sir James Tyrrell was already kneeling, ready to receive the fatal blow, when a messenger arrived with a royal pardon from Richard III. The pardon arrived so late that, according to reports, Tyrrell's hair turned white from the shock. However, this pardon did not prevent Tyrrell from being brought back to the Tower years later, this time with no chance of escape, accused of participating in the murder of the princes in the Tower. A similarly dramatic case occurred in 1553 with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. As he ascended to the scaffold, a royal messenger arrived with what appeared to be a pardon, only to reveal that it was merely a postponement of the execution, allowing Dudley to witness the death of his co-conspirator, Sir John Gates. Upon being informed of the nature of the message, Dudley lamented, "This delay of the day is only to taste the bitterness of death twice. Protocols of maintenance and tools of death." Executioners, though feared, also followed strict protocols to ensure their tools were in optimal condition. The maintenance of axes and swords was essential to ensure that executions were quick and clean, although sometimes the executioner's nervousness or inexperience led to failure. In 1597, a tool inventory was documented, including axes, swords, and blocks, with detailed maintenance instructions. The edges of the axes had to be sharpened with high-quality stones and oiled with whale fat to ensure the cleanest cut. Executioners such as William Rose Warden, 1566–1578, kept records of their tool care, including methods for storing their axes in leather covered in salt to prevent rusting. One of the most disturbing practices involved testing the blades of their axes on pumpkins filled with red wine, a macabre technique used to simulate the resistance of human flesh before a real execution. Executioners' attire and perquisites. The executioner's attire also followed a set of ritualistic rules. While one might think the black mask was meant to conceal the executioner's identity, it actually symbolized the impartiality of death. These men wore dark clothing, mostly black or grey, and leather aprons to protect themselves from blood splashes. On special occasions, such as royal executions, they might wear ceremonial hoods made of black velvet. Executioners were not only compensated for their work, but also had certain privileges when it came to the personal belongings of the condemned. After each execution, executioners could claim the clothing and other personal items of the executed. For example, after the execution of Walter Raleigh in 1618, the executioner, Richard, kept Raleigh's velvet cloak and silk doublet as part of his fee. This privilege of claiming the condemned's belongings became standardized in the 17th century, and by 1600, a detailed schedule was in place dictating which items could be claimed by the executioners, while jewelry and other valuables had to be returned to the executed person's family. Throughout the centuries, the executioner was a figure surrounded by both fear and mystery. Strict protocols, dramatic scenes of pardons, and poorly carried out executions contributed to an atmosphere of horror that persisted in the Tower of London. These men, entrusted with carrying out death sentences, were not only responsible for the physical execution, but also for managing the psychological weight that accompanied each strike. Without a doubt, the role of the executioner in the history of the Tower is one of the darkest and most enigmatic, marked by brutality, ritual, and terror. The legends and ghosts of the Tower of London. The Tower of London, an iconic fortress in the heart of the British capital, is best known for its history of power, treachery, and execution. However, what truly distinguishes it is not just its connection to royalty and historical events, but the legends and ghosts that seem to inhabit its ancient walls. With centuries of dark stories, the tower has witnessed dramatic deaths and supernatural events that have left an indelible mark on the collective memory, turning it into a place of mystery and terror. The ravens, the mythical guardians of the tower, continue to fly over its battlements, seemingly silent witnesses to secrets that refuse to fade. The executions carried out within the tower were not only moments of bloodshed and suffering, but also emotionally and politically charged events. One of the most tragic and well-known episodes in the tower's history is the execution of Anne Boleyn, wife of Henry VIII and mother of the future Elizabeth I. On May 19, 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold with remarkable composure, despite the anguish she must have experienced in her final days. In his letters, Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, documented the incredible grace with which Anne faced her fate, even mentioning that the Queen mocked the executioner before her death. The chosen executioner, the French swordsman Jean Romeau, made such a quick and precise cut that Anne's head was severed almost before she finished her prayer. The account of Thomas Wyatt, poet and prisoner in the Tower at the time, reflects the anguish of this event. "These bloody days have broken my heart," words that still resonate today. Anne Boleyn's execution, marked by the speed of the swordsman and the condemned woman's serenity, has become one of the most discussed executions in English history. Just 18 years later, another queen met a similarly tragic fate, Lady Jane Grey, the 9-Day Queen. At only 17 years old, Lady Jane was executed on February 12, 1554, by order of Queen Mary I, after being proclaimed queen in a political uprising. In her final moments, the young queen displayed impressive serenity. Baptista Spinola, an Italian merchant present at the execution, wrote that the sweetness of her countenance surpassed everything that a human being had ever shown at the moment of death. The young queen remained brave, reciting prayers until her last breath. Today, her spirit remains one of the most documented presences in the Tower of London. The Tower staff keeps a record of appearances, especially on the anniversary of her execution, with many claiming to have heard her voice reciting prayers in French, specifically Psalm 51 before her death. The mystery of the White Tower and the presence of spirits. But the ghosts are not limited to royal figures. The White Tower, one of the oldest buildings in the Tower of London, is known for its supernatural activity. According to various reports, fluctuations in temperature and electromagnetism have been recorded in this area, coinciding with places where blood was spilled during executions. Dr. Elizabeth Chambers, a paranormal researcher, documented in 1999 how electromagnetic fluctuations coincided with the bloodiest events in the tower's history. According to the researcher, the air seems to have a memory, retaining the traces of the tragedies that occurred there. The apparitions of Walter Raleigh and other spirits. Another presence that has been notably active is that of Walter Raleigh, who was imprisoned in the tower before being executed in 1618. His spirit has been so frequent that many of the tower's guards mention him in their accounts, referring to his former room as Walt's study. Raleigh, famous for his exploration and writings, seems to continue showing his presence at academic events. In 2018, during a scientific conference at the tower, a group of physicists reported strange phenomena. The smell of tobacco was detected, and Latin mathematical calculations were heard in an empty room. Security camera footage revealed a figure walking through the tower's hallways, accompanied by strange lights, which, according to experts from the University of Cambridge, could be related to theoretical models of spiritual energy. The Salt Tower and the Medieval Palace. The Salt Tower is another location famous for its paranormal activity. For centuries, visitors have reported strange smells of sulfur and the sound of glass vials clinking, as if an alchemist were still working in his laboratory. This tower was used by Henry Croft, a 16th-century alchemist, who apparently remains present in the place even after his death. On one occasion, blue lights were reported inexplicably shining from the tower's stones, adding another layer of mystery to the site. Not far from there, the medieval palace, a place that once housed a polar bear gifted to Henry III, is also associated with paranormal phenomena. Ghostly roars and strange claw marks on the walls which mysteriously disappear have been recorded here. In 2020, motion sensors detected what seemed to be the movement of a large animal in an empty room. A subsequent investigation by the tower's security team failed to find any logical explanation. The supernatural encounter of 2024, Catherine Howard. The Queen's House also holds secrets. In January 2024, a group of conservation workers experienced a strange time slip during a renovation. According to their testimony, for several minutes, they found themselves transported to the 16th century, where they witnessed a surreal vision of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, running through the halls, screaming for mercy before her execution in 1542. This incident was witnessed by 5 workers, who later confirmed that the details of the furniture and decor matched exactly with historical records from the Tudor period. This encounter has become one of the most recent and chilling events in the tower. Guards and testimonies of living history. Veteran guard John Kane, in his book Guarding the Ghosts of History in the Tower, reflects on the persistent presence of the tower's spirits. In his memoirs, he writes, "The tower is a place where the shadows of the past continue to walk among us. The stories are not only remembered, but they happen again, as if time itself refuses to leave." The ghosts, like the ravens, seem to be the invisible guardians of a place where the stories of blood continue to live on. In the Tower of London, history never truly ends. The spirits of those who lived and died there continue to mark the passage of time, reminding us that within its ancient walls, the past never fades. The Tower of London is much more than just a historical monument. It is a silent witness to centuries of history where the echoes of the past continue to resonate powerfully. Over the centuries, this place has witnessed dramatic events, blood spilled on its floors and lives torn away at the scaffold. What once was feared as the gateway to death has now become a reminder of those who lived and perished there, whose stories remain alive not only in historical accounts, but also in the legends and supernatural phenomena that persist to this day. The ghosts of figures like Anne Boleyn, Lady Jane Grey, and Walter Raleigh, along with the memories of bloody executions, continue to fill the corners of the tower. The ravens, with their majestic presence, have become symbols of the historical memory of this place, watching over the secrets that still hide within its stone walls. Beyond the myths and apparitions, the Tower of London is a testament to human frailty and the permanence of historical legacy. Every brick, every room, every hallway carries the mark of betrayals, sacrifices, and forgotten lessons that invite us to reflect on the history of power, ambition, and the inevitability of death. In this place, time itself seems to stand still, as if the spirits of the past are trapped in a cycle that never ends, forever guarding the secrets and tragedies of a past that remains alive in the present.